Okay, so run me through this real quick. What's the...
All right, we're going to start. Well, we're here at the Quiver World headquarters,
Yep.
so I had to give you a can of our fresh nitro cold brew.
It looks fantastic.
Yeah,
It's decaffeinated.
This is late in the afternoon. We've just got off our coffee meeting, so we're going into the decaf. Yeah, so we make America's #1 nitro decaf cold brew.
Okay.
Which is really, really cool.
It is very cool.
That is a thing.
So what's the move here? The only ingredients are filtered water and coffee.
That's it. Nothing else.
And it's only 99.9% caffeine free.
Yeah, so we use a Swiss water process. There's a couple of different ways to strip caffeine from coffee beans, and the major one is chemically stripping.
Okay.
Which is as bad as it sounds, leaving a lot of residual stuff that you just don't want to ingest. The other option is a Swiss water process, which is a bit more expensive and time-consuming and involved, but there is zero chemicals. It's completely natural, and it is 99.9% caffeine free.
Close enough.
It gets the job done. So it's like we definitely fill the hole in the market for mothers who are nursing or pregnant, or people who are just trying to reset their adrenals and or just enjoy coffee in the afternoon or evening.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. So what's the move here? It says shake hard, pour fast.
So the cool thing, when we started Quiver, we wanted to bring, it was as the pandemic hit, we wanted to bring cafe quality beverages direct to people at home around the country. And a cool thing about going to a cafe is getting a nitro cold brew on tap. And so to recreate that in a can, we use as much food grade liquid nitrogen as we can, which removes the oxygen, keeps it really fresh, but also you're able to recreate that poured from a tap cascade that you would get in a cafe. So to do that, you shake hard.
I can hear it.
It expands, and then you're going to want to crack slowly, especially in front of the equipment.
It's going to sound satisfying, though. Oh, that was a great one.
And then pour fast.
Pour fast.
And so what this does, it basically breaks the nitrogen out of solution.
Okay. I feel like a bad bartender right now. This is not how you're supposed to pour a beer.
In any way works. So then you can see it stack out, and you get this really creamy texture and mouthfeel with no sugar, no dairy. Like everything that we do is just keto, paleo, Whole30.
Cheers.
I beat you to it, but
it still counts.
Isn't that good?
That's very good.
For decaf, like decaf got such a bad rap for such a number of years, and I feel like finally the market's moving towards like, hey, it's cool to not drink 400 milligrams of caffeine twice a day.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd still do that. I love that. But like, I think perceptions are changing, and it's really cool to see where the market's going.
Yeah, that is super cool.
Yeah.
Why do you think it got such a bad rap? Like, was it because of that chemical stripping process that it was like, or is it just people weren't doing a good job with it, or just stigma?
I think a little bit of everything. I think decaf was always secondary. Like people wanted to get caffeine and wanted to like get that jump. So decaf was always really old coffee. It was over steeped or like burnt. And it was just like, if you were in a cafe or a restaurant, decaf got zero attention. They just like sent it.
Yeah.
And then there was like a whole movement, like death before decaf, where it's like, no, like I'm going to get all my shit done. Like I'm going to drink caffeine. It's like, now it's like, actually, I want to monitor my levels of different stimulants or depressants or various concoctions, which when we get into microdosing and stuff like that. So I think people are becoming much more aware of what they want, and I think they're leaning towards quality as well as taste. And we wanted to give people the option to have a really fucking good tasting decaf.
Yeah. That is like, it's an interesting movement. Like the non-alcoholic beverages market too seems like it's blowing up right now. All this sort of like people who still want the experience but don't want the physiological side effects of the experience.
Yeah.
Do you see like coffee going the same way, that like decaf is going to keep getting bigger again?
I think that it's probably got a roof on it. Like I'm not sure we're going to see the same amount of like coffee varietals in decaf the way we do in normal coffee. Like, hey, I want a light, fruity African light roast and like, oh no, I like a water processed Central American coffee. I don't think that decaf's going to get to that point. I think that where we've pushed it to with the nitro cold brew as well as the hot steeped coffee option we've got, both in regular and decaf, I think that's it. That's just what people want. They just want a great tasting cup of coffee that doesn't have caffeine in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes so much sense. How did you guys get into this? Because you are not like from a coffee lineage really, right?
I'm not, but my business partner, my brother is. He started his journey, and maybe we should get him on at some point in time, but maybe I tell his story with more excitement than he does, but as anybody does. But he, at a very young age, he was very excited about learning hands-on and coffee. And so he got a job in a roastery nearby in the Berkshires and fell in love with everything to do coffee and sourcing and the farmers and families who produce it, to roasting, to then final presentation. And after many years roasting and then consulting, he opened his own coffee shop in his early 20s. And then from there progressed into sourcing tea from around the world of the highest quality and flavors. And then he got into world whiskeys and natural wine. So he's definitely, the last 25 years has spent in beverage and quality beverage with a story to tell. And through being around him, being business partners in various things, I've learned and appreciated his knowledge, and that's rubbed off on me. And I was like, oh yeah, like I actually definitely want to consume something that speaks to how it was sourced and grown and wasn't lab created.
Right.
That's important to me. And so that's how we got into Quiver. We had a family cafe, and we still have a family cafe, and COVID was hard, and we wanted to bring cafe quality beverages to people.
That's so cool, man.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
What
Where are we going with this conversation today? What are you thinking? What's on your mind?
There's so many things we could talk about. That's what I was just thinking about. I guess like I'm curious about so many things. Okay, so I have a direct question for you that I was thinking about the other day.
Okay.
So you're from Australia.
I am from Australia, yes.
You were born in Australia.
I was born in Australia.
Where in Australia?
A little town called Sydney.
Okay, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, that's the one people have heard of.
They like opera there, right?
The Opera House is a beautiful, beautiful building. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you been there?
I have, yeah, a few times.
What'd you see there?
Oh, my father is gonna kill me for this one. I cannot remember.
Something.
I saw something when I was there last, right before COVID. I've been to a few shows over the years. We went for a school trip when we were young. Yeah, Sydney is great. The cool thing about Australia is it's such a beautiful place, and it's underpopulated still. So everyone lives on the coast in the nice parts, in the major cities and the few towns that run up the coast. But it was a beautiful place to grow up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's my question. You go by Ash.
I do.
Your full name is not Ash.
It is not.
Did you get picked on for your full name when you were younger?
Not in Australia.
So that was my question.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a very like American stigma.
I was like, where are you going with that? Like I see, so my full name is Ashley Robertson Crawford.
Which is a sick name.
Thank you. Yeah, I like my name, and it's got a cool little family history to it. And in Australia and England, my father's from London. Ashley is a really popular male identifying name. And so Ashley's usually spelled Liegh for the female, or various spellings of. So Ashley, Ley, has always been a pretty common name in Australia. And I was going to be Ashley no matter what I was. My mother loved the name, and she was like, this is Ashley, before she even met me. I go by Ash now. I can almost pinpoint the date. It was probably, I think, like July 20th, 2008. I was at college orientation in Denton, Texas, and sort of fresh off the boat from Australia, so to speak. I was going there on a golf scholarship. And so this is like day one in Texas, never been to the great state of Texas, and I was all excited. And I get there, and they're like, okay, putting us in dorms for the weekend. And sign in. They're like, yep, okay, up there. And literally had that experience where I opened the door to the shared dorm and there was a girl getting undressed or redressed for the day. And like just had that like, what a comical moment of opening the door and being like, oh shit, like I'm in the girls' dorm.
Yeah.
So like I go back downstairs, and this was sort of at the end of a summer in America where like every bank, every like restaurant reservation was calling me Miss or yeah. And I was just like, oh, I'm so over that. Like I don't want this to just every piece of official paper from the American government to say Miss Ashley Crawford. So from that day, I went by Ash. And so everybody who knows me prior to July 20th, 2008 knows me as Ashley and still calls me Ashley. And then everyone after that calls me Ash.
Yeah. That's funny. That makes so much sense. That you asked me about my voice earlier. I used to have that experience all the time. If I was going to like a Dunkin' Donuts drive-through. Yeah. They just off me ordering, I would get like pull up Miss and stuff. Like, I guess my voice was high enough that they just assumed I was female. I do feel like I have almost like relaxed into it a little more. Like it was funny. We were watching a video. Today is the 10-year anniversary of me meeting my wife. We were at a costume party and there are videos from that party. Yeah. And part of it's just me being younger, but you can tell that when I get like excitable, my voice like runs up higher. Yeah, yeah. And even just the last few months of like intentionally slowing down and de-stressing, it's funny because I feel like I can feel it coming back down a little bit.
Interesting. Yeah.
But yeah, it is an interesting. I sometimes wonder like, at this point, I've just decided that it's what I got and I love it and I'm not going to, beat around the bush about it anymore. But it is funny when you have those experiences like, me a few years ago on YouTube where people were like, it would be great if you could have a different voice, or people being like, well, it would be great if you could have a different name. And it's like, well, sure, man. Right. But like, we don't really pick this stuff.
Interesting you say that, as like, I just watched your documentary, that's sort of about Chandler Smith there, and it was fantastic, by the way.
Thanks,
it was,
man.
But you prompt some questions throughout as a part of the storytelling, and it's like, I loved your voice in it. It was like it. So I'm not sure where that came from, and I guess the other note on that is when I lived in LA for 4 or 5 years in the entertainment industry, I did work with a phenomenal dialect coach, Amy Chafee, and she's wonderful. Worked with some of the most incredible, talented actors, excluding myself. And we worked on accent as well as voice. And I am a believer you can definitely change how your voice is. And I worked really hard at trying to sound less Australian and more American.
Really?
Yeah. So it was an interesting thing. But there is, I think that I don't think that you need to change your voice at all. But there are definitely options. Why do you want
to sound less Australian?
For more commercial roles.
Australian is easily the coolest accent. I will die on this hill that it's like people who think they want British accents really want Australian accents.
Right. I'd totally have to agree with that. And I think the time that I spent in Hollywood was, it just closed a number of doors for commercial work. They were looking for something a little bit more generic. I mean, there was opportunities for an Aussie bogan, fully slang Aussie accent, but most of the time they wanted somebody that was more generic. And so it was, for us, it was about rounding out. My mother's American from LA and father's British. So I've got a bit of an influence in all of them. And after a few years in Texas with roommates and teammates from Mexico, I had this fantastic meld. And so in the end, we just leaned into that sort of Cary Grant like, I just sound like me. Yeah. But I'd like to own sounding like me instead of swinging between American and Australian. And that's where we sort of got to with it.
That makes sense. I had an experience a few years ago. Oh gosh, it was probably like 10 years ago, because I was visiting a college and I was hanging out with these people. It was a college in Texas, and we were just talking and they were like, "Are you from New England?" And I was like, "Yeah, why?" And they were like, "You sound like you're from New England." And I was like, "I don't feel like I sound like anything. Like when I hear me, I just think of myself as like, that's just like a neutral American accent for the most part." But I think it's very like water you swim in. Cause then I go to like Ohio and I'm like, oh, you guys have accents, but they're probably like, no, this is just what people in America sound like.
Yeah.
But they specifically pinned me for the use of the word wicked as being like a very New England thing, which I don't think I do as much now, but I probably used to.
I'm probably I'm gonna hear that now that you've said that.
Yeah.
But no, I wouldn't pick up on that, I don't think.
So the accent thing is interesting. You were trying to do it more for like professional reasons, that it's like it's a liability to not be able to sound American.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on? I cannot understand the people like the Tom Hollands of the world who can just snap in and out of it. That it's like you hear him talk normally and he's like super British, and then you watch him as Spider-Man and he's like super not British.
Yeah.
I feel like you need to like bifurcate your brain to just like go into that mode. Like, can you fake your way into being extra American if you're thinking about it?
I did get to the point where I would go into audition rooms and not tell them I was Australian. I'd take that off my resume, and it was passable. You could, instead of possible, I could switch it enough. I learned how to say my name and carry a conversation, and pass as an American who had traveled quite a lot. And I think that what you're describing is I like to associate it with like muscle memory. It's like you do a lot of training or weightlifting. It's the same. It's like you know how to pick up and clean a barbell, and you know how to snatch a barbell. They're like different movements, but your body knows how to do it. So it's the same thing with your mouth and your jaw. Like a lot of the work that I did with Amy, the voice coach, was exercises to make my jaw move in the right way. And it would get really sore. I'd do a few hours of speaking American and my face would hurt.
Yeah.
I was just like, all right, like, and it's a lot, that said, it's a lot easier to go from Australian or British to American. Just the way the cadence and the flow of the language goes.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder to go from American to Australian and get it right. Because what we do is we go low to high. Yeah. Like, hey, how are ya? Yeah. It's like, and it's a little bit of a spaghetti twist in there, where American is very simple and straightforward. It's like, duh. Yeah. It goes from high to low. Hey, how are you? It's like always goes from high to low.
I heard it for a second. Yeah. That was so a good American, hey, how are you?
Yeah. So it's a much simpler, lack of a better word,
it's almost like an intonation thing.
Yeah. So it's like, so it's not your fault that your Australian accent isn't fantastic. It's just going to be a little harder than Tom Holland going from British to American.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that's like that whole concept of like, it's all movement patterns and neurological, right? It's like, what are the sounds and patterns that your body and brain know how to do? Mm-hmm. And like when I went to Iceland a few years ago, we had like this local producer, and his name was, he would always say, just call him John, but his name was like Jorn. But it's one of those, like, it's got syllables in there that we can't make, where he was like that J sound, whatever that, like, yuh, is like, my mouth doesn't know how to do that.
Right.
But then, going the other way, it's like, it's literally a different biological experience of like how your jaw is used to moving, like you're saying, like how your airway is moving.
Yeah.
And that we just adapt to the people around us. But there really are all these different crazy things you can do with your voice.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. And I think that I would love to do a little more voice training. That was one of those like challenges that you pick up, whether it's like a sport or it's a skill, a fine art skill. It's like something that sort of hooked me. I was like, oh, I'm not very good at this, but I can see the path forward and the practice involved, and it's exciting to see improvements with it. So I got very energized by it. I love that little section of learning. Yeah. That it was fun. It was definitely.
There's this really fun video series of this guy who is like, I don't know if not that it matters. He's super white. I don't know if he's American or British originally, but he's like lived his whole life in China, and he speaks like impeccable Chinese, but he basically goes and like trolls Chinese people, where he'll go to like a food truck and you can watch them all be like, oh, this guy. Yeah. And he'll like start being very like American, and then he'll just snap into being like the most Chinese person, and people like freak out because it's like it's so dialed in. There's something
That's
really
fun.
cool to me about that it's like when you can just go like you can snap into that mode. Like my buddy Dennis does that a bit with Russian, where it's like he grew up Russian, learned all his English, but he can just snap right back into Russian. I was like, I wish I had like another plane of connection like that. I mean, I guess like in some ways like filmmaking is that for me, right? Like it's a different mode of communicating and operating through a space in some ways, that it's like, I guess that's an interesting idea to me. That's like, if you think of these planes of like business, creativity, nutrition, even like it's all some level of learning a new way of navigating that space. Right? That it's like learning to eat in a way that totally serves your body in some ways requires you to learn new brain patterns and new movements, like you trying to play with how your jaw moves.
Sure, yeah.
Where it's like if you've only ever experienced one thing, it gets really sore when you start doing it in a different way. And that then where it's like, oh, well, this is hard, I don't want to do it. And it's like, well, learning how to talk the way you want to talk, earn the money you want to make, have the body you want to have, all of that requires the uncomfortable process of learning how to do something differently. Because the most comfortable thing is the loops that we all currently all exist in, right? That it's like, I go through this pattern of what I eat and what I drink and what I this and what I that. And that process of going like, what's a little tweak that I could make? That's like, okay, well, I want to go act in these kinds of movies. Like you're Tom Holland. I got to learn how to speak really fucking good American English.
Yeah.
And like, is that easy? No. A lot of people would be like, I'm just going to go get another job. But some people do it. And when you see someone that's like, oh, he has the ability to snap into the mode he needs to for that plane, or, you know, you look at a Matt Fraser and like what he's able to do at a competition or anything else. I think that for me is just like part of my personal great curiosity and what I've gotten out of my journey with like commercial filmmaking. And part of what I'm like trying to impose back into Challenger is just this awareness of like how much access there are to all these crazy experiences and parts of the world, both like geographically and just like experiences. If you're willing to go, if I challenge this loop I'm in and learn a way to do something a little different, now I get more access to something, you know?
Why do you think that some people explore that or latch on to that spark of curiosity and others don't, whether it's to improve their physical fitness, their diet, nutrition, or their spiritual well-being? What do you think it is inherently that does it? Do you have an idea? And you might not know.
Yeah.
There's a question that I'm sort of trying to ask myself.
Yeah. I had this conversation or something similar. I was at breakfast with a buddy the other day, and we were talking about sort of this shared experience of like there being a period of your life where you are like very inside the box, and it feels like the box is like slowly closing in on you. And then there being some point where like all of a sudden, from my perspective now, it's like I feel like I'm outside the box and I can see the box, but you're able to like explore the edges. And as you explore the edges, the box gets bigger. The big mystery to me is how the hell I ever got out of the box. Because I don't think most people do.
Right.
And that's the thing that is like, I don't have a good answer for that. Outside of like his posited answer was basically like, you hit a point in your life where you love something enough and your current belief system gets in the way of the continued ability to interact with that thing. And that you decide you care about loving that thing more than you care about your previous rule set. And you're willing to totally reframe your worldview for the sake of keeping what you want. And that once you learn you can do that, you just keep doing that. Which I think is an interesting way of looking at it.
What's an example of that?
I mean, the easy example for me, honestly, is like, I definitely had that experience growing up in like the American evangelical world, where like I was raised on, you know, handwriting with Bible verses, and we're going to Sunday school, and, you know, here's all the stories and all these experiences where like we weren't allowed to watch MTV. We weren't allowed to watch Cartoon Network. We weren't allowed to like skateboard, tattoos were bad, all these things. And there was some period of my life where like that all made sense. Mm-hmm. And then I don't know. I feel like I was always like the irony of it to me is that I feel like so much of what I was taught was like how to think critically about these kinds of things, but then they like don't want you to apply it to their thing. And so then there came a point in my life where like my parents separated. And it was sort of this like big chasm that I just fell into of like a series of events after that, where I honestly just felt like I don't believe that anyone actually believes this based on the way they're acting. Mm. If you really believed any of this, like you would show up differently here. You would communicate differently. You would spend your time differently. And so it was sort of this like cognitive dissonance experience where I ended up basically totally walking away from that. Mm-hmm. And once I walked away from that, at the time it's like the scariest thing, because especially if you've ever fully believed that like walking away from this has eternal consequences for my experience through the rest of my life, right. It's like a bridge most people won't cross.
Right.
But if you're willing to cross it and then you get out from under it and it's like, oh, maybe that doesn't all mean exactly what I thought it meant. And then going and like looking at all these other things. And so like for me after that, I was like, okay, I'm going to go look at science. I'm going to go look at all these other spiritual practices and religions that I were told you shouldn't look into. And then as I started to look at all of those things, it was like, oh, there's actually all the things that I liked about my Christian experience for the most part are ubiquitous across all these experiences. And all the stuff that I personally couldn't really reckon with feels very localized to like this little community I was in. Mm. And that's something that's like, I feel like it's a sensitive topic because people take it really personally, but I really personally look at it as like, for better or worse, I feel like I grew up in a cult. That it was like, it's just an ideological feedback loop, and don't question anything, don't push back on anything. And that if you care enough about the people around you, and I think that was part of it for me, is like, honestly, just the cognitive dissonance of the idea that like, what I say, like if I say frick versus fuck, that affects where I go forever. I just couldn't make sense of that. Right. Like that doesn't compute to me. Mm-hmm. And so like, I think once I started getting the courage to be like, I just refuse to accept that. I get that that's the way that you're reading this. I don't think that's what that means. Mm-hmm. That now everything comes on the table, right? Like if we've accessed that fundamental limiting belief and gone, okay, how can we make it serve us? Which is another thing that's like weird about, I think, a lot of the way that stuff gets taught is it's like serving yourself is somehow bad. And that was another thing that just never really sit right with me. Like this idea that, what I grew up with was like, man is fundamentally wicked. And I was like, I don't see that. I just don't buy that.
Right.
And so like, then going through the other side of it of like, okay, like how can I focus less on all of that and just focus on like, how do I show up on a daily basis to spend time in ways that I enjoy with people who I enjoy, continuing to explore the world we live in. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, okay, well now financially, what are the tools there? Relationally, what are the tools there? And then hitting some other breaking points where it's like, I had that initial thing and then I was still sort of playing along for a little while. And then we had a few specific situations where like we were at a church like small group thing. Mm-hmm. We were having this conversation that was like about whatever, the book of Jonah. And I just brought up this thing that was like, I think it's really interesting if you look at this story as a metaphor. Like if you were to just go like, if you were just reading this story to a kid, what's the point of the story? Instead of getting hung up on all the like weird intellectual arguments about how a fish swallows a dude. Mm-hmm. And people stood up, said that I was a heretic. Mm-hmm. And that I couldn't say that with kids in the building, and left. And then left the church. And were like, this is unacceptable. Mm. And that was like, honestly, like a comical experience for me at the time, that I was really like, this is how frail your perception of your idea is.
Right.
Right? Like that's that scary to you. Someone even saying that is that scary to you. And to me, it feels very similar to the thing that's like when Muslim extremists are threatening to kill cartoonists, right? It's like, you can't draw our deity like that.
Right.
And it's like, I don't think the deity gives a shit, dude.
Right.
I don't think there's anything in the Bible that says, don't think about this in any other way than the first way it's presented to you. Mm-hmm. But that for me was sort of, it was like, okay, like I have to find people who are willing to like turn the Rubik's Cube around as we're trying to solve it.
Yeah.
And I think most people only ever want to look at one side, or every part of their life is like a different side. And then so they view their financial thing as totally independent, and their interpersonal thing as totally independent, and their health and fitness thing. And I personally see myself as a person that like, it's all the same to me. Like it's all input and output. It's all how are things flowing. It's all how are you investing and using your values of generosity and integrity and investing in the things that you love, and how does that play out in the world? Mm-hmm. But most of us just get this super compartmentalized view of everything. And then it's like, you don't let anything touch. You know, it's like keeping all your food in different parts of your plate. That it's like, oh, well, my Sunday church thoughts don't ever interact with my business ethics thoughts, or my retirement plan thoughts, or my what my kids say and do thoughts. Mm-hmm. So this is a very long answer to your question. But like that, for me, it was like the moment where you just let everything touch. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, now there's opportunities everywhere. You know, now I can learn from everything. I can take what I've learned about fitness and apply it to my business stuff. I can take my business stuff and apply it to my creative stuff. I can take my creative stuff and apply it to my relationship stuff. And that now the like opportunity for growth becomes so much faster and so much greater. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the other thing that's like, when I talk to like Matt Fraser, it's like, he's a structural engineer. He went to school for that. Mm-hmm. He is 100% using all his engineering knowledge in CrossFit. But then I found out that most pro CrossFit athletes don't think of it like that. They just like think of it as like, you just come in here and you burn it down and you get better. Mm-hmm. And it's like, as I started to talk to all the top people in every discipline, it's like, oh, they're all using all these other schools of thought to make themselves great. Mm-hmm. And the people who are second best are always sort of viewing it in this myopic way. Mm. And so I think that was sort of the long story of like, where I was like, okay. And that was sort of where Challenger came out of this idea of like, the challenge is to look at everything, like to still apply context, right? Like there's some amount of context that goes to all these things. But if you're willing to look at everything, now you grow. And every time you grow in one area, you reveal something you didn't know about the other area too, that you can come back to and go like, oh, okay, well, like I just learned the things that I learned about how I was being like a shitty husband to my wife actually also applies to like all my business relationships. Mm-hmm. And then now when I fix those business relationships, I reveal something about my financial opportunity that I didn't realize was a core limiting belief. And then all of that feeds into like why I feel like I have to make myself feel like shit at the end of a workout because I deserve to be uncomfortable and sore and miserable. Mm-hmm. And so like now you have this like star-shaped feedback loop, which actually just ends up being way more effective in my personal life than trying to keep everything in its own little world. Because you just have such limited diagnostic data at that point.
Effective how? When you say effective, what do you mean?
I think like effective in that context I think is often blinding because we don't realize our own embedded feedback loops in that context. I did a sales workshop last year with this guy who's a creative sales professional. I knew it was something I was bad at. I wanted to get better at it. And one of the first things he made us do was role play, but you weren't allowed to role play the industry you work in. So you had to immediately be like, I forget what I had to do, be like an IT for large companies salesperson. Mm-hmm. And the point of it was you often fall back on your expertise in a way that causes you to not show up as the best version of what you need to do here. Because you stop talking about solving their problem and you start talking about video things. And so we're going to pull you out of that and make you just be a salesperson now. And I think that's true. Like when you don't realize your own built-in biases, that it's like, oh, how I show up as a husband is directly related to like how I was treated as a child. And when those two things are totally separate in your mind and you can't compare them, then it's like, well, why is my wife always unhappy with me? Why is this like, that was where I was like 26, 260 pounds or maybe I was 24, I don't know. And like about to get a divorce. And I was like, I don't get it. I can make money. People like me. Why am I a shitty husband? This doesn't make sense. And then as like I started to go to therapy, it was like, oh, because I have all this context from my childhood that I'm projecting onto this. And that context is actually pulling back down my ability to show up as who I want to here. And so when we start to compare contexts, it's like, oh, why do I think that these people are able to like charge this much money for the thing they're doing, but I'm not? And is there actually a good reason for that? Or is it just like a core limiting belief I'm having? Because when you start to look at all of that, it's like, oh, well, now there's more and more opportunities to show up as who you want and still be viable. And I think like I lived in a world that was very like, this is the small box I'm allowed to play in. And the more that I started comparing those things, it's like, oh, I have all these options available to me about how I can communicate, how I can express myself, how I can experience my feelings. And sometimes it's looking at that out of context situation that allows you to like feel a feeling that maybe you were suppressing somewhere before too. Like I think my own like fitness journey even was like, it really made me aware of this idea that like, man, if I want something, I'm entirely capable of getting it. Why am I so scared of letting myself want things? And like, I think those questions are also really overwhelming to a lot of people. And that's sort of, I guess, my reflection of why like, I have come to the idea that I really validate the bravery of anyone willing to be honest about anything. Because most of us, it's like admitting that you've spent the last 8 years as a shitty husband is too heavy for you to face it and do anything about it. So you just keep doing it. You know? Like, I think that's the thing that when I look at the way my parents showed up, the way the people, even honestly, the people who were in the church, like you could see the cracks of like people who definitely weren't fully on board with this. But it was like the pain of admitting that you've potentially spent the last 10 years of your life in a way that has actually harmed people just as much as it's helped them is greater than the pain of just continuing to do it. And that was the thing that I was just like, I refuse to live my life like this. Like if there is something that I can improve, I will improve it. And that doesn't mean that I have to feel bad about myself either, because the act of facing it and choosing to improve it is the most rare, bravest, challenging thing you can do. So
I agree. I applaud you for the work that you're doing, man.
I wasn't expecting to get on a soapbox here. So
I mean, well, yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I guess my follow-up question to that is like you've done and doing a lot of really challenging work. And it's inspiring, and we're each on our own journey of like hopefully trying to live better lives and better versions of ourselves for our own sake as well as the people we love and care about. Is there anything that in that journey, have you just done this all from internal, like figuring it out, deep thinking these questions, or is there anything that you found really helpful or ways of looking at things or people or systems that have helped you like unlock some of these ideas or at least crack the door open to, hey, it can be different. We can look at things differently.
Yeah. I think like, I think probably the biggest initial thing is like finding people you can just be honest with. And like, if there are people in your immediate network taking advantage of that, and if you don't have those people, I think that's probably the biggest undervalued aspect of like getting a therapist.
Well, so was your wife not one of those people originally?
No. And I think that was part of like, I had so much built in like shame and desire to be perceived as good, which was another thing that I think I picked up a lot from this like church culture was like, everyone wants to act like they're doing great. And it's not really okay to not be doing great.
Right.
And so it was like this weird thing that like you'd be at like high school camp and they'd all, you'd go up and do like, don't have sex before marriage talk. And then it's like, we're all going to sit here and listen through this. And then we all know what everyone's actually doing.
We're all going to have sex after this.
Yeah. And it's like, that was like an experience that I was just like, I felt like I popped out the bottom because it's like, okay, well, apparently these people can't deal with the real world. I see the real world. I was like a 12-year-old on Live Leak watching like ISIS behead people. And I was like, this shit's a lot messier than like this weird, really curated view of it we have. But so then my built-in thing was like, people just can't handle the truth.
Okay.
People can't handle reality, right?
Yep.
And so like, even once I got married, it was like, I don't want to like push that edge too far with anyone, including my wife. So I'm going to like stay pretty safely inside my own perception of their own capacity.
I mean, that's a good point that you brought up, that like truth is scary, and like people, I guess, is that old Jerry Maguire quote, like you can't handle the truth.
Yeah.
Is that I might be misquoting that, but it's like, yeah, that's a good point you bring up. Like, and from my experience, I've seen that. It's like, people don't want to know. They don't want to know what the sausage is made out of. They don't want to know what's going on behind Procter & Gamble's doors. Right. And like, they want to live in that matrix, for lack of a better word. But then there's people who, like yourself, who I'm attracted to, is like, who are challenging the way we look at things and be like, hey, actually, there's not necessarily a better way to do things, but there's different ways to do things.
Yeah.
And I have a belief that is better. That if you can have empathy for different perspectives, that's where true wisdom comes from. Right? Like,
yeah, 100%. And that's where, like, if you can get a space where you can talk to anyone, and be 100% like no holds barred honest. That's the biggest thing that I feel like by the time I didn't get a therapist until like COVID, but once I did, I was just sort of at this like, I don't have anything to prove to this guy point. And It was like, it probably was one of the first times that I had been like totally honest with people. And I had that experience a little bit too, because I was struggling with like my own behavioral coping mechanisms. And so I started going to like some 12-step recovery meetings too, which is like another thing that I feel like there's a lot of like stigma against, which I get. And like, I was sort of against it too. But the biggest thing that I got out of that was just being around other people who were honest about the stuff they were struggling with.
Right.
That it was like, none of us are going to pretend to be perfect. We're all going to say exactly what we did. And when I hear a guy go like, oh yeah, like I was clean for 3 months and then I like went out with some buddies and ended up like waking up in jail and, trashed my car and whatever else. It's like, one, I get it. Two, I feel a little bit better about myself now in a way that's actually helpful, because I've lived under this burden of feeling like a piece of shit for stuff that isn't that evil.
Right.
And so it's like, there's this thing in recovery that they talk about that's like the perception that you're the piece of shit at the center of the universe. Right. It's like, I am both, everything revolves around me and I am the best, but I still feel really bad about myself. And like that idea of like, we get really used to living life on 1 in 10. And that the 1 is what causes you to have to like rebound into these coping mechanisms. It's like, if you just got comfortable living between 4 and 7, life would be pretty great. And so like that whole process going like, okay, I'm going to pull myself back inside of myself a little bit and be honest about what's going on.
Right.
And then reflecting on like, I guess like we could talk about this, but like, that's where I got into IFS therapy too. And which was like a whole crazy world for me, because I had no clue what to expect. I had no prep. I just went into my first session and was like, I'll do whatever now at this point. Like, I'd gone through a few years of like getting dry needled and doing CrossFit and getting coached, and like, whatever people to tell me to do to get better, I'm just going to do it.
Sure. Yeah.
And so when he was like, go to this feeling, I want you to picture the feeling. And I had this like whole almost like experience out of a movie where I had like all this resentment towards my dad at the time. And it like visualized as this black swirling ball. Like I call it, have you seen Lord of the Rings? There's like the Palantir in Lord of the Rings. It's like the black bowling ball that like Saruman uses to look into things. I was like, it feels like that. And then it was like sitting with that and the energy of that. And then, this whole progression of like, I forget exactly what happened next. I really wish I had recorded that or me telling that story initially, but it was like I got sucked through into this other place where now I was in this like it looked like bombed out like Belgium during World War II. It's just like one of these like desolated air raid cities. And there was little like 7-year-old me there. And I was like, what the fuck am I doing right now? Like, what is this? Like, how am I'm not high, but I'm suddenly in a different place interacting with a different version of me. And then, he's like, what does that part want to tell you? And I sit there and it had stuff to say. And I was like, wait a second, this is me, but this is also not me because it knows things I don't know.
Right.
And like, then starting to pull that thread in the next like 2 years of going like, what are all these little parts of me and what do they believe and what are they afraid of? And how can I connect with them? But like, I think that's been, in the midst of everything else, the biggest game changer for me. Because I didn't realize how much I had parts that were affecting how I showed up in work meetings, how I had parts that were affecting how I was pricing things, parts that were affecting why I didn't want to pick up the phone when people called me, like all these little things that were related to this just like unawareness of my own internal landscape, I guess.
Right.
How did you get into IFS therapy?
Yeah. I completely agree with the sentiment of that going down the rabbit hole. It's like the Alice in Wonderland into yourself, and IFS, internal family systems type of therapy that you and I both do. And I've been doing it maybe 4 years now.
Okay.
And got into it through family. And I'd competed at a really high level in golf, and I'd worked with sports psychologists at pretty high levels at different universities, and it never really resonated with me. I felt I could outsmart my therapist every time. And it was just this very like intellectual match, and it just didn't work for me. And my family, my brother and his wife had come across IFS through one of our family members is pretty involved with Dick Schwartz, the founder of the structure of the system and the way of looking at the internal system. And so, I went and thought I'd give it a try. And it's been a wonderful, eye-opening journey of just, for me, it was a way of looking at how parts of me affected other parts of my life. And it just clicked. I was like, I get this. There's nobody to outsmart.
Right.
It's like, let's take some time and let's look at parts who have something to say, who are protecting maybe a younger version of me or a hurt version of me or an idea that I'm holding on to. And how can we listen, show up and unburden them ultimately and spend more time acting from self? Because I was finally able to realize that we are self, and that's greater than all of our parts. And we have parts that have developed skills and have served us really well. And each of them have a really core belief that it's life or death, and they're really protecting us from something, which I'm so grateful for. And it's also very cool to be able to look inwardly and say, hey, I'm now 30 and I'm here and I'm me and I got this. Like, I'm not 5 years old anymore, and like, we're safe. We're good. Like, tell me what's going on in your world, and to like watch those internal parts of you take a deep breath and be like, oh, I've been sitting in World War II Belgium for 15 years and like holding on for dear life, keeping our shit together. Like, thanks for showing up. And like, those moments are so special. And it's that's been my experience. It's been super, super cool. And I think that's one thing that brought us together pretty quickly. It's like, I think I'd mentioned that in passing and your eyes lit up and I was like, wait a minute. You know what IFS is? Like,
yeah.
And it just adds that level of communication between like my brother, his wife, my girlfriend, and it's just a fantastic way of being able to communicate the goal is to communicate from self to self and not communicate reactively from a part that might be triggered about something. And it's such a cool dynamic when you can communicate with somebody self to self. It's just like the realest thing you can get. Not like, this is the image of me that I'm trying to project, and this is the part that's showing up because this is what you want to see. And you might be showing me another part, and now it's like we're basically bystanders, and we're watching these alter egos have a conversation or a fight, and being like, hey, I got this.
Yeah. So. Well, and the ability too to like communicate when you are coming from a part, like that's something that's been really helpful for me and Mandy, is like being able to go like, sometimes something happens and you get flared up, and it's like being able to identify and communicate that idea that's like, I don't know, whatever it is. Like, I remember when we first got married, like I didn't have the language for it at the time, but like I had a part that got totally overwhelmed when someone would walk away from me during like an argument or a disagreement. And that part just remembered like my dad leaving when I was younger, and being able to go like, I get that you need space. Like I have a part that gets overwhelmed. Like, can you just tell me that you're coming back? And that's all that part needs to know, right? But like, instead of me just freaking out, it's like being able to go, okay, what's the real need here? What's the concern? How do we both, because we're both on the same page. Like that's one of the big upsides of both of us doing this work too, is like we can communicate across here that it's like, my part gets really worried about this or anxious about this or hates when you do this or feels this way about itself when that happens. And being able to communicate either this is where the part's at or this is where I'm at. I think has been a super valuable tool for us just digging into. And it's like you slowly get the ability to actually like unravel a little bit of that, where I think like without that framework, we spent years that was like, you're just constantly butting heads. And as you start to like actually look at the reactive forces, it's like they all just sort of calm down a little bit. And that's like, celebrating 10 years of knowing each other now, it's crazy to just reflect on like how much less reactive and therefore how much closer we really are, because I think so much of that reactivity is what removes us from community and connection. And that's the hard part, right? Is it's like there's a little bit of this feedback loop where it's like your fear, your parts, your parasympathetic nervous system, whatever that whole interaction is afraid of being alone and unloved and not having what it needs. And in the process, it pushes people away. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's part of the thing that's still a mystery to me, is like, and maybe that's the whole thing with like, at some point you just said like, fuck it. But like, how do you start the feedback loop that's like, now I can feel that like parasympathetic response continually coming back down, and just like my sympathetic nervous system being able to just be. Yeah. But that initial thing for people on the edge of like, how do you start that process is the real mystery sometimes, because we have so many like, I think about like when you see a dog get rescued that's like been super abused, right? And it's like, it won't even let anyone near it. Yeah. And that process of being like, no, you're going to be okay. Like, I'm here to help you. But so many of us have these abused dog tendencies that we like bite the people around us who are trying to help us. Sure. And I think that's part of, for me, like why as much as I didn't think that we were going to get into all of this, that this is a big part of, for me, like what I would love to see happen with Challenger is just like create a little bit of a safe space online for people to see that like it's okay to have these conversations, and it's okay to admit that things aren't working, and it's okay to like go get help, and that like everyone doing something really great has done that at some point. Because I think that's the great myth, is that like there's like successful people and then people that suck. And it's like the successful people all used to be people who suck, and then at some point made a decision not to anymore. Sure. So like wherever you are, like if like 11-year-old, porn addicted, threatening his dad with suicide, low viable skill Evan can get to this, like anyone can get to anything. Right. But the question is like, are you going to sit in the feedback loop, or are you going to actually look at it? because if you look at it, you can change it, you know?
Right. But I think that, yes, and people have to want to change.
Right.
And it's like anything. It's like, I can tell you to work out a certain way or to look at your diet a certain way. But if that doesn't come from intrinsic motivation, then there's no point.
Right.
But like that's one of my goals is sharing as much as I do online is like, I'm not an expert on IFS or physical health or diet and keto, but I'm swinging fucking hard at the ball. Like I want to learn, and I want to be an example to people that like, hey, like there is an alternative to McDonald's 5 days a week. And there is an alternative to like not having the energy to like run around the block and lift some heavy weights or like whatever it is, like it is possible, and it takes some work, but it's the most fun and enjoyable work. It's like, yeah, I spent my 20s going from short-term fling to short-term fling because that was so much easier than taking a look at myself and being like, oh, why do I walk away after 2 weeks? Like, what's that like wall I come up against? Because it's like, it's not about them. And it's like, I got to the point where I wanted more from a relationship. And that took me looking internally into like, hey, what's going on? What parts are down there? And it's really hard, empowering, rewarding work. And it's really, really cool. And there's like, I don't know if there's anything more rewarding than being able to communicate at that self-to-self level. And I'm just thinking about your example, and it's like some of the ones that I have with my girlfriend. It's like, it is difficult to talk from a place of part, but when you are able to separate that, it takes the personal or the animosity and it diffuses the situation. And the example I think of for us that we had worked through is like, she would show up from coming in from work, or like I would, and she would sort of walk past me and like go to the kitchen or do something. And before parts therapy, I didn't know what was going on, but something was like, hey, like we feel really bad right now. And like, I just want her to like look at me and say hi and give me a kiss, and then like go like, and then what IFS allowed me to do was to like dive into like, hey, what part of me is triggered right now? And how do I communicate that in a way that is helpful to me and my partner, that isn't like, I need you to like kiss me when you walk in, like, because I want you to do that and you're making me feel bad. It's like, no, like that just starts conflict, and I'm speaking from an angry or a triggered part. So then when I dove into it and did my work, I'm like, okay, hey part, what's going on? Be like, I have this part that really feels like a need to be seen. And when Heather comes home and walks by me and goes and does something, I'm not being seen. I'll be like, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, I'm not mad at her or angry at her for not seeing me. It's like, I have a fear that she doesn't see me and I'm not worth seeing, and that I don't matter and I'm not important. And so when I'm able to distill it down to that, and I can be like, hey, part of me is scared that I'm not worthy of being seen by you. And part of me is worried that you might leave me. And when I can communicate it in that way, that just opens up space to be like, for her to respond, being like, oh, that's not an attack on me. Like, that's a very vulnerable state to share from. And like, there's a few people in your life that you can make requests of about how you interact. Like, I'm not going to talk to the lady at the bank about communicating with me differently. But if you're in a relationship, it can be like, hey, are you willing? Part of being in the relationship is like, yeah, we're willing to work on unburdening these parts together, or being supportive or showing up. And so she's able to take that in and be like, wow, I had no idea. Like, I see you, I love you, I value you, like, you're important to me.
Yeah.
And like, cool.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, I feel great. Like that just like lit me up inside. And it's, but I feel like most people spend so much of their time not having like the skills or the tools to be able to communicate some of these feelings that just, it's painful.
Yeah.
It hurts. And it's like, and that's the coolest thing that I think I guess selfishly I get out of IFS is like, I feel better or less hurt more often. Like it's cooler to be unburdened and lighter in the world and be able to communicate in a way that is actually constructive.
Yeah. Well, it's the scariest thing in the world, you know, like any of these things, but it works. And I think that's the thing that's like, when you get into any of these things that it's like, when you start to change how you eat, change how you communicate, change any of these decisions, it's like, it always feels like dying at first. Like the first time, I don't remember the specific first time, but I know for a fact that like the first time that I was like, I'm just going to tell her how I really feel, it felt like the world was going to end, and then it doesn't. And then things get better and you're like, oh boy, this is a game changer. 'Cause it's a lot easier to sit there and be like, whatever, to get in these surface level spats about like, well, you don't do the dishes. Well, yeah, well, you don't this. Well, this, let's
never
tip for tat everything. Right. It's never about that. It's like, and that's the thing, the other thing that's like, once you get into all these deeper things about people feeling seen and known or less than or whatever else, and you can actually meet the need of that. Like sometimes there is a surface level thing there that's like, and it's okay. Like that's something that's like, I've come to terms with the fact that like, I could live in a messier house than my wife does and be fine with it.
Right.
She feels more at peace if the dishes are done at the end of the day.
Right.
I love her enough to grant that request for her. But when I go just like, it's not just like, oh, you're so annoying, you don't do the dishes. It's like, no, she feels loved when her kitchen is clean when she goes to bed.
Right.
I say I love her. That is a way that I can show up and show her I love her. That now it's like, and now she feels loved, and then she wants to know, how can I make you feel more loved? And now instead of us being in this devolving game where we're picking at each other and slowly trying to just get out of each other's hair,
right,
you're actually making headway to like, what makes you feel more loved? How could I help you? How could we spend more quality time together? And like, now everything starts to get better. And that like also to me translates out to like, that is part of why I like media stuff the way that I do. Like that was part of my thing with the Chandler doc, was like, people support people who are honest. And for some reason we think they won't. And we think that everything's dollars and cents. And we think that everything's this like net zero sum game. That's like, the only way you sell coffee is you make the cheapest possible coffee and you sell it for the highest possible markup. And that's the game. The only way that you make a happy wife, happy life is you do everything that she says and you don't have any conversations about how you feel and you move forward. It's like, that's not the actual game, man. Like, I don't know. That's the thing that's like, I still don't really know how to say, but it's like, there's people playing the game differently. And when you meet the people playing the game differently, your whole world changes. And like, that's the thing that's like, when I meet people, I can still have fun and interact with people who view the world that way. But I'm also like, not really looking to invest a ton of time in them, to be honest. Right. And so when you meet someone, like when we got that first, we went and got burgers or whatever, it's like immediately you're like, oh, there's all this stuff, like small talk is eradicated.
So what do you think that is? You say that meeting people that are playing the game differently. And I know what you mean when you say that.
Yeah.
What is the common denominator between those people? Is it the fact that they're working on themselves and they're in some version of therapy that feels productive? Is it just their outlook on life in general, like this unwavering curiosity? You might not know. It's a question that I'm also trying to answer.
I think the like simplest explanation I could give is that there's like two pieces of it. And one is a willingness to show up for yourself for the sake of showing up for yourself. Mm-hmm. That's like I've lived the years of my life experience where I didn't show up for myself, and I know how that feels. And I've started to see how my own lived experience gets improved by me doing that. And I care about that more than I care about anybody else's perspective of me now. Mm-hmm. I think that that's like the linchpin. When you can figure out that like showing up for yourself is more important than other people's opinions of you, the whole game changes. The second level is that once you show up for yourself and now have all of your, or at least let's say most of your parts swimming in the same direction, you're not operating out of a fear-based position. Your parasympathetic nervous system is downregulated to the point that everything isn't scary. Now you see opportunities. And now you see really creative ways to show up in those opportunities. And so the people who are all playing the race to the bottom reductionist game are operating out of this fear-based mindset. And that the people who are willing to go, despite all the evidence to the contrary, I'm going to say fuck the fear and show up for myself. That act of as your walls come down, you can suddenly see the forest for the trees. And now it's like go time, right?
Right. So is it, if I'm repeating back, is it something along the lines of like we as humans have fears, and we have parts, whether we are in IFS or not, we all have a history if we're here at this point in time. And there's people that are, like you said, the race to the bottom, who are fearful. And it's not like the other people playing the game differently we're speaking about, maybe you and I, don't have fears. Is it the fact that we're able to face them and voice them to ourselves at the very least, that we can acknowledge, hey, part of me is worried that I'm not good enough, or part of me is worried that you're going to leave, or it's part of me is fearful that I'm never going to earn enough money to be a father and provide. Is it the fact that we can just own some of those fears, or are aware that there are fears that we haven't even identified yet, that we're like open to finding, acknowledging, and then unburdening? Is that the difference? Maybe part of it.
Yeah, I think like for me, the way that I look at it, I was talking to a friend about the fear of drugs basically the other day, like people who are like either really afraid of THC or psilocybin or whatever it is. And my personal perspective on that is that I can only show myself things that are already inside of me. Mm-hmm. And my world has only ever gotten better by looking at things that are inside of me. Mm-hmm. And so at this point, like I've just seen that pattern enough that there's this idea, Stephen Pressfield is an author who has this concept called the resistance. He has a book called The War of Art, but he says the resistance is always the greatest in the direction of your greatest impact. And so I think for a lot of people that like fear and resistance is something to go away from. And I think once you realize that like every time you just walk into that brick wall, you walk out into a new and better world. So you just start looking for brick walls. That's the way I see it. It's like, I'm a little bit of a Kool-Aid man now, that it's like, go tell me what I can't do, go look in myself and go, what is this part afraid of? And go like, I'm going to show it that's not true. And so everything that I see as a core limiting belief, I'm just going to go show up in the world in a way that proves it to not be true. And then once that becomes the mission, like there's always scary things to go face.
I love that. And maybe to add a layer on top of that is something that I came across is about fear or being scared of something, and that visceral reaction that your body gets can be flipped around by breathing. So when you're scared of something, an idea or a physical thing, your breath shortens, you're hyperventilating in a way, your muscles tighten. If you are able to breathe deeply into that moment and fully face that fear is the same feeling within that is excitement and exhilaration.
Right.
So if you're staring down something and you're like, this is scary as fuck.
Right.
But like you breathe deeply into it, you like face it head on, like you're saying, what part of me is worried about this or scared of this, and see that, you can flip that into exhilaration.
Right.
And that is, once you can do that, that is fucking cool.
Right.
Because then you're saying you're walking around looking for brick walls. Like, yeah, I'm looking around for tiger sharks and like doomsday things that are in my business world or personal life. Because I'm like, hold on, let me take some deep breaths. Let me stare right into it or like myself, and let's fucking go.
Right. Yeah. It is like the whole world changes as you start to do that. Like, and that's like, I don't know what the turning point on that is, but like for me, some combination of breath work, therapy, meditation, physical intent. Like, I think there's some element of like that mind, body, spirit triangle, right? That it's totally, like, if you're super underutilizing one of those three things, you're not going to hit that pocket. Mm-hmm. But if you can come back inside the pocket of all three of those things, now everything, it was an idea that we wrote early on with Challenger, was like people who see obstacles as opportunities. And to me, that's exactly what it is. It's like when you flip that switch. Yeah.
Right.
But you're flipping the thing that it's like, it doesn't even feel like an obstacle anymore. The thing that used to feel like a brick wall that was like, oh, that's impossible, or that I don't want to talk to that person, let's say, right? Like we were talking about meeting people. It's like, oh, like I don't want to bother the lady at Big Y, so I don't say anything to her. And it's like, everyone likes to be seen. Everyone likes to be known. Like the act of like, we got burgers earlier and we were talking to the girl who checked us out about our ink, and she was telling us a story of her twin brothers. And it's like, it's a little thing that's like, the whole world, like all these relationships open up to you. People are curious about you. Like you just start like seeing things differently. Whereas I can remember for myself a few years ago where I was in this world of just like spending all my time in my office, trying to figure out how to like be more successful. Didn't have time for anyone. Just wanted to like Uber Eats everything away. And I was like measurably successful in like very few lanes from the outside, but like internally I was miserable. And then like the fear is like, oh, well, if I were to like let myself experience all these other things, this like, let's say financial is going to come way back down.
Right.
But every time that I like go out and let my world get bigger to the stuff I actually care about, like that stuff just does better, which is the paradox of it all, right? Like it's the hardest thing to pitch someone on because everyone in that moment's like, oh yeah, that's not going to work. Like I even think about it, it still happens with my parents. Like I'll talk to my parents because they're still incapable of talking to each other 18 years after separating or whatever. But it's like, if I were to be like honest with that person, they would somehow use it against me. And it's like at some point someone's got to stand up to that.
Right.
Is it going to be you or is it going to be the other person? Because you can play chicken with the other person forever, but you're the only one who can 100% guarantee someone's going to stand up to it.
Right. Whatever
that looks like for you, you know?
Yeah.
Dude, you got me going way too much. It's my own fault. I'm not actually blaming you, but I was like, I had all these things I want to talk to you about, and I feel like it turned into me talking.
I feel like this is more than a one episode conversation.
That's
for
true.
Sure. I mean, I feel like part of the cool thing about what you're doing with Challenger is hosting these conversations, and I appreciate you encouraging me to be a part of it, and something I definitely want to do more of, and find more people that are challenging themselves. And like, it's a cool space to be in.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, dude. I agree. And I will say selfishly, I am really grateful because I've definitely had a few people like, I don't understand, like, why are you talking to like designers and marketing people and CrossFit game athletes? And it's like, it's hard for me to explain. So I feel like this is like, it's a long explanation, but maybe it'll help people go like, this all makes a little bit more sense now.
Yeah.
Cause I think people like, it was funny. I had a few friends who were at a filmmaker meetup in Chicago, and they were like, people were talking about like, what the heck is Challenger? Is it like a CrossFit production company? Is it this? Is it that? And I was like, I can't really explain it to you, man. It's a home for my crazy people. Like all these weird Challenger crazy people, they exist, and we're all gonna do cool stuff together.
Yeah, and we're gonna film it, and we're gonna record it, and
make some sick content.
And hopefully there's some takeaways. And if like people come across this next week or a couple years from now, like how cool would that be if somebody fucking reached out and was like, hey, I'm curious about IFS.
Yeah.
Or like, you know what? I've had these feelings bubbling up and I've been living in a community that like doesn't sit right with me.
Right.
And I don't want that anymore. I want more.
Right.
And it's like, and it's okay to want more. And it's like, and that's not just more money or more abundance or what, like there is so much more to give in the, like you're talking about meeting people and saying hi. It's like, if we have a family coffee shop and I stand there at the register and I take people's orders and it's like nothing better than just like looking in somebody's eyes and like cutting them off when they're trying to just order their latte for the third time this week and be like, hey, I see you. How are you doing? Like for real, like what the fuck's going on?
Yeah.
And just like stopping people in their tracks and just like they take a breath and like, hi, like, thanks. Like whatever direction they take it, it's just like, it's fucking cool to see.
Yeah.
I mean, we should put a camera. I mean, there's a whole lot of legalities with that, but like that would be just a thing. Just like not stop people, but just like to
pause for a second.
To offer a platform where people can like take a breath and be like, hey, there's some cracks in my beliefs, or there's some daylight coming through different doorways, and I'm going to go through that.
Right.
And I'm going to see what's on the other side if I lean into whatever it is.
Right. Well, I think that's like, that brings up a whole other thing, which is just like the reality of allowing a crack in your beliefs. You don't, in my experience, you don't get to stay the same person. Like if you actually open that door, you will not be the same person. I mean, you are, but like your beliefs change, how you show up, your whole world changes. But again, my experience, it only gets better. It's always scary, but every time I put one of my beliefs on the altar and go like, either it holds, or if it doesn't hold, things get better. And I feel like we have this fundamental fear that if it doesn't hold, it's going to get worse.
Right.
And like, I have a hard time, I was trying to figure out a way like to design a lyrical or shirt way of describing that, but it was something I had written a while ago, was like, the truth doesn't burn. And like, so anyone who's afraid of torches knows, deep down this isn't true.
Some like Daenerys Targaryen shit.
Yeah. So, there's a little bit of anarchy in there, but it's like that's always the thing that like, even I look back on myself, that's like, if you're so confident you have it right, to my younger self, why are you so afraid of talking to people about why you do things the way you do? Because if you're doing it perfectly, no one's going to have anything to say.
Right.
And people sometimes have things to say despite the fact you're doing it right. I'm not saying you should listen to everyone, but I'm saying that like being open-minded and intentional and like, there's a whole bunch of nuance we could get into with that, but like it always makes things better in my experience.
Totally. I mean, once you go through that door of new discovery or challenging a belief system, it's empowering. It's like, I know what goes into fast food. Like I've gone through that door and I eat in a very different way, but I'm now empowered and I choose to eat a whole fucking pizza every couple of weeks.
Right.
Out of a different place. Like I'm making that choice from self and with the knowledge of what that actually means instead of blindly consuming a belief system.
Right.
And that's the coolest part. It's
right.
like you go through a door, you can always go back through.
Right. You keep the parts that work for you.
Sure. Totally.
And that's like that. I just saw Gary Vee say something about that. Actually, we were talking about Gary Vee, but like he was talking to someone who was like, I had left my job in finance or whatever. And she was like, my parents don't get it. And he was like, best news, you can always go back. There's never going to be less than 1 million jobs in finance tomorrow.
Right.
And like, that was one of the things that I felt very clear on early on, even in my own journey, was like, I can always go get a full-time job.
Yeah.
I'm a capable person, so like I might as well gamble as long as I can. And if I really put my back against the wall, like I just go get a regular job.
Yeah.
But we should stop talking.
All right. I think this is a good place to leave it. Dude, that was awesome.
See ya, internet.